Morning, everybody, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished members of the Institute of Corporate Directors of Malaysia. I am very delighted to be here to address you this morning, and actually very privileged as well. And when I look at the room, I'm a little bit daunted. I've become more daunted as people have introduced me. When this first started, I was approached by the ICDM and said, would you come and have a little chat? This is slightly more than I expected. However, what I would like to do, you've heard a little bit about my biography. I'd just like to give you a little bit more information. I first came to Malaysia in 1957 with my family, or rather perhaps my family first came to Malaysia with me. That's probably a better way of putting it. 1957. And my father was he was an Air Force pilot, and he was brought in to fly helicopters in Malaysia. And of course, when we arrived, the emergency happened. So he was on active service straight away. And we lived in Penang. And Penang in those days was a little different from how it is today. Some of you remember Batu Ferringhi. When we knew Batu Ferringhi, there were two hotels. The Lone Pine and the Golden Sands, and the Lone Pine is still there. Yeah, very interesting. So we lived in Penang for quite a while. And then in 1962, we moved to KL. My father was seconded to the Royal Malaysian Air Force at that stage. And just as he was seconded, of course, you had the I guess the insurgency in East Malaysia. So again, he found himself on active service. But one of the things that he did do is that he was a choice pilot for the Yang di Pertuan Agong. So whenever the Yang di Pertuan Agong wanted to fly around in a helicopter, quite a lot of the time he would be the choice pilot. So we have quite a long connection. For me, more interesting in terms of change and development, in 1994, I was posted to Singapore to run a subsidiary of British Telecom, looking after all their businesses in Asia Pacific. And one of the very first jobs I had was to fly to KL to meet Telecom Malaysia, because one of the first contracts we won was a ring network system between East Malaysia and the mainland. And as we flew into KL and we got into the taxi and was driving towards the meeting with Telecom Malaysia, I had my project manager with me. We drove along the road and said, Petaling Jaya. I used to live in that village. Yeah, I kind of realized my mistake. The interesting thing when we lived in that village was it was a 25, 30-minute car journey into the centre of KL through jungle. I think it's sort of more concrete jungle now than jungle. But those are the changes that we've seen. And I think that really starts off the beginning of the talk today. I'll just finish that off. That's where we kind of went into KL. It is a VUCA world. That little story tells you just how much things have changed. And what we mean by that is it's volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And I'm going to talk through this. I'm going to bombard you with a whole load of little slides and pictures and things like that. I don't want you to get too worried about the detail. I don't want you to get sort of think, oh, there's too much information. I'd like you to concentrate on really two, what I would call red threads. The first red thread is that as you look at the information coming down towards you, is to say we need to think and spend more time in the future. As leaders and as directors, we need to find a way of being comfortable in a very uncertain zone, which is this future, 5, 6, 7, 8 years out. And you think, how can I do that in a volatile, complex world? Surely it's so complex you can't do that. But if you think about what we do at board level, most of what we do is within the current year, the annual report. It's very difficult to move out into the future. We'll explore that a little bit later. And then the second red thread is once you feel that you can be comfortable thinking about the future, is to say, if I am comfortable in that zone of uncertainty, how can I make better decisions? What will make me set a longer-term vision and purpose and set strategies by being that comfortable in that uncertain place? So that's what I'm going to do. You're going to get a lot of information now very quickly, but hang on to those two red threads, and I'll revisit them as we go through. Okay, volatility. Unfortunately, I do go back quite a long way, and I have been in business really since the early 70s, 1970 in fact. And when I first started, the Suez Canal was closed. And was closed for a number of years. Imagine what that would be like now, although we're now talking with global warming about going around the north, the northern routes. And then you've got the Belt and Road Initiative, of course. So maybe there are other things, but that's the sort of thing that's happened. I was in the oil and gas industry for about 14 years. And I know we've got people in the oil and gas industry here. It has been up and down and up and down over that period. 1973 spikes, 1979 spikes. I had just been made first managing director in 1985. in the oil and gas business. And I was just congratulating myself at 32 about how well I was doing. I said, God, I must be fantastic. And the oil price went from $35 a barrel to $8 in 4 weeks. And we suddenly had a whole load of equipment. Now, trying to deal with that environment was really quite taxing. I suddenly realized I wasn't that good. I didn't know very much, and I had 2 years of real pain. It was a very salutary lesson. Not just the oil industry, but we've had recessions and crashes around the world. There have been 4 major global recessions in my period, and there have been 3 smaller ones around the world. Some of you will have lived through most of those. It seemed that most of those crashes coincided with me getting a new job on a board. And I said that to somebody when we started a desalination company. I said, there is no way we're investing in you. Good. A little sadder, of course. The world has become very, very volatile in terms of armed conflict. If you go right the way back again, looking at my time, we're talking about the Vietnam War. We're talking about Falklands War. We're talking about Iran War. We're talking about Gulf War I, Gulf War II, Kosovo, Bosnia. Loads of conflicts, Syria today. You probably even forget about the American excursions into places like Cuba, Panama, Grenada, Somalia, Lebanon. Okay? When we look at that litany of conflicts, we forget that this has been the most peaceful 80 years since the Second World War. It sure as hell doesn't feel like it. But that's what people say. This has been the most peaceful period since the Second World War. And, of course, volatility isn't helped by these guys. And this is just the tip of a very ugly iceberg when you think about it. I always find it very strange that the fate of 8 billion people on this planet is in the hands of people like this, when you think about it. Very worrying. So yes, Trump, Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un, Putin, Erdogan from Turkey, and Syria, Assad, yeah. And that is just the tip of the iceberg. But of course, volatility isn't helped by the way the leaders behave and how they perform. So it doesn't make our life as leaders any easier. Would you like to be led by this man? Yeah. I am emigrating. It's just that Europe won't have me now. Yeah, yeah. So there we go. So that's volatility. A lot of information. Think about the red thread. Think about how do we think about that future 5, 6, 7, 8 years out when it is so volatile. Uncertain. Think about what's happening in terms of the world powers, what's going on at the moment. Things are changing radically. China is definitely in ascendancy. I have no idea really where America's going at the moment. There are loads and loads of papers, learned papers. Some contradict each other. But certainly there is a change in this rules-based society. And America is stepping back, if you like. We'll talk about that in just a second. Oops, sorry. More worryingly is that democracy is in retreat. Okay? There are not that many democracies in the world, believe it or not. And 30% of the world lives under authoritarian or at best, totalitarian or at best authoritarian rule. 30% of the world. 14 of the major democracies are in Europe, and the score for their democratic progress is actually reduced over the last year. And you can imagine why. The way that France is operating, some of the problems in Germany, but certainly Poland and Hungary putting up borders and things like that. So democracy is in retreat in many respects, and the overall score around the world has lowered, whether it's a democracy, a near democracy, or whatever. So probably not good news. Liberalism, and here it says Western liberalism is in retreat. Some of you may think that's no bad thing. But what I mean by that is whether you worry about whether it's Western liberalism or not, is that the rules-based society is kind of under threat. And from a business point of view, not having rules makes things very difficult. Who do you trust? Who can you do business with? Will a contract be honoured? Is the financial framework sufficient for us to trust it to do business? It starts to undermine the ability to do business with strangers. And then we go back to our tribal enclaves, because we can only do business with people we trust. And that kind of breaks down. So that becomes quite difficult. And of course, what happens with the retreat of democracy and, of course, the breakdown of the rules, you start seeing populism rising, you start seeing a lot of discontent, mass demonstrations. You're seeing that all over Europe at the moment, whether it's because of the right or the left or whatever the issues are, but certainly you're seeing a lot more volatility in terms of populism. Not helped by things like mass migration, most of which is economic migration, and that causes real problems. You see people throwing up the barriers. In Europe, you've got countries like what they call the Visegrad countries, so Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic, have now completely broken, if you like, the rules of Europe by throwing up borders, not allowing immigration to happen. They're being censured by Brussels, but it's not doing a lot of good. So again, this is causing huge tensions across the world. Think about what Trump is saying in America. Really, really tough. Okay? So again, this creates a huge amount of uncertainty around the world. Lovely little one, this is really worrying, cyber warfare. Okay? You'll probably find that there'll be lots of smaller conflicts. I don't think there'll need to be another world war, if you like. I think most of this will be done in the cyber world. The ability to bring down power grids, the ability to hack into all sorts of secure sites, whether it's intelligence sites. I understand that the personnel records of the administration in America were hacked into. Everything from people's drinking habits, sexual habits, were all hacked into. That's personal. That's really personal stuff. So really tricky. So cyber warfare, I think, is a major, major element about how things go forward. And think about most of us in business. What do we think about? If they can hack into highly secure sites, what does that mean for our business sites and things like that? So, industrial espionage, innovation being stolen, all of that sort of thing. Quite tricky. And a lot of companies, any company around the world who's doing interesting things and good things in terms of innovation and creativity is kind of now subject to this sort of thing. So I think it's very real. And if you talk to people who are specialists in this field, they get very concerned about it. And when we come to talk about complexity in just a minute, you'll see that, sorry, not complexity, but the ambiguity, you'll see that the things are really moving very fast and they will affect this area as well. Okay, so just remember, a lot of information coming out. Remember the red threads. How does the future look? Can we feel comfortable in this sort of future to manage a business long term? Okay. And finally, of course, you have trade war. The main one, of course, that we're looking at is America-China. It is a really interesting scenario that's playing out. The rhetoric is ramping up. And if you look at some of the sort of militarization that's going on behind this, this could well be quite a key issue, not just for trade, but for general security. It's amazing how things can deteriorate very rapidly. Okay? So it all sounds like bad news, but hopefully we'll find some high spots in a short while. Complexity. We talk about this word complex very much, and we just kind of need to understand it. So complexity isn't actually the end system either. We talk about simple systems, complicated systems, complex system. There is a worse one, believe it or not, chaotic. So the terminology is generally about complex. I think a lot of what we're doing moves towards chaotic. Okay? But a simple system, let's take an electricity example. A simple system is you flick on the light switch and the light comes on. A known action creates a known outcome. It's predictable and it's reliable. A complicated system is one like one of the old power grids. You've got big power stations, you've got quite a complex grid. You've got variable demand, especially when the adverts are on in a highly popular program. Everybody puts a kettle on, demand peaks up. It's a complicated system, but the outcomes are predictable and the controls are predictable. And if you do this and something, it's quite complicated, but if you do something here, you've got a pretty good chance that something over there will happen in a predictable way. Complex is completely different. Complex is like a very modern smart grid where you have the big power stations, you have wind farmers who are putting in unpredictable loads, which may be there when the wind blows and maybe when it doesn't. People with private solar cells, big solar cells, variable power coming in, variable demand. This is now a complicated system, okay? But it pales into insignificance with the way our world works. Our world is a mess of interwoven connections. Think about power, think about telecoms. Think about how telecoms work, incredibly complicated, very diffused, and very, very chaotic in many respects. And when you get outside actors, if you have cable breaks, if you have things which you just cannot control, you start to move into chaos as well. So it's really quite complicated. But even that begins to pale into insignificance when we talk about supply chains. And now we get to the heart of business. You think about global supply chains, and it is absolutely massively complex. And if we take one of the sort of the foundations of modern society, the smartphone, so this year about 1.5 billion users. I don't know whether you know this, but about 30% of the world has a smartphone. About 70% has a modern communication device, if it's not a smartphone. 70% of 8 billion people have one of these things. So the supply chain that goes around that is massively complex. Okay? It is millions of people in tens of countries working on getting this stuff around the world. I might just have some figures. I can't remember the figures offhand, but let's get my glasses. I'll just... yeah, so on this smartphone, 1.5 billion will be made around the world. They account for 33% of Taiwan's exports, 17% of Malaysia's exports, 16% of Singapore's, and 6% of China's. Memory chips will come from South Korea, Vietnam, and other countries. System chips come from Malaysia and Taiwan. Displays from Japan and South Korea. All of this lot has to come together, and it's made by millions of workers around the world and then shipped. It's a really complex supply chain. And most of them are. Think about making airplanes, Airbuses and Boeings and things like that. Think where everything comes from. These supply chains are incredibly complex. And when we talk about trade wars and things like that, how easily they could be disrupted. Everything is really intertwined. So this is not just a complex system. This actually can be quite chaotic, especially if you get outside effects, like politicians and trade wars and restrictions like that. Very tricky. And then finally, I wanted to talk about this because this gets to the heart of ESG. ESG is very, very prevalent at the moment. So this is environment, social, and governance issues. And I want to draw to this rather sad event, which was the BP Gulf of Mexico Deepwater Horizon accident. 20th of April, 2010, 11 people were killed. Okay, it wiped 51% of BP shares in 40 days. They've now about $65 billion in costs so far. Okay? So really quite a big event. And if you think about how the world reacted, especially America, it was vitriolic. The CEO, Tony Hayward, was vilified by the media. Obama, normally quite a restrained sort of man, said, I'm going to put my foot on British Petroleum's throat, and I'm not going to take it off until they pay. Okay? So quite vitriolic. And that was the environment of today in terms of when things go wrong in terms of ESG. By comparison, I'd like to take you back about 30 years, 22 years before BP, a little project called Piper Alpha. I don't know if anybody remembers the Piper Alpha accident in the North Sea. One or two people do. Sadly, I signed the contract for the removal. We had assets that were involved in this. I signed the contract for the removal of Piper Alpha. So back in 1998, 167 people died. There was pollution. It was a real mess. Occidental, who was the lead producer, there was no vilification. There was no outright. There was no media spotlight. And interestingly, their shares only dipped about 4% briefly. Their costs were only a few $100 million initially, and they tried to claw some of that back. More interestingly, within a very short period after the event, they had 150 lawsuits out against 26 contractors. Can you imagine what would have happened if BP had done that in the Gulf of Mexico? But it was relatively similar because they had subcontractors responsible for large amounts of work. And after the event, what you may not know is that money did change hands. People were liable, Halliburton's, people like that. There were reckonings to be made. It just wasn't in the press. BP was in the spotlight. And from an ESG point of view, in the modern world, when we talk about complex, it's been raised up. Social media, media in general, now shines a spotlight very fast and very brightly on anything that we do that's marginally wrong. And this stuff, some of this stuff is very big news. So I'm afraid that world has changed as well and made our lives much more complex as leaders of organizations. Ambiguous. My absolute favorite, this one. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this, just checking the time. I've got an alarm clock here. Ambiguity is probably the toughest one for us Volatility we know about, and we can kind of see some of that coming down the line. Complexity, yes, we know the world is complex. Uncertain, yeah, well, we know we've got some strange people in charge of what's going on. But ambiguity goes to the heart of what we have to deal with as business leaders, I think. Hopefully you'll agree with me when you see these few slides. Tesla, electric cars, there is a big shift coming. If you think about it, a lot of countries in Europe are saying 2040 to change to all-electric vehicles. They're now saying it should be earlier than that. Norway, I think, is 2030 now. The move is definite. After the Dieselgate scandals with the German cars, you're seeing a lot of the German production looking at electric cars in a very big way. China is way ahead in terms of thinking about electric cars. Self-interest, they need to do something there about pollution and things like that. That's not what I want to talk about. I don't want to talk about electric cars in terms of global warming. Who thinks that the electric car could be a geopolitical destabilizer? Have we thought about it? Yeah, interesting. Why do I say that? If you think about oil and gas, if you think about petroleum, about 60 to 65% of oil is used in transportation. If you start to move towards electricity, it doesn't matter how fast you do this, but let's say you start to have a perceived, consistent and persistent move towards electric vehicles. You don't have to get to large volumes of oil. Once you set the trend that that's the way you're going and the price will start to soften, all of a sudden, anybody whose whole economy is dependent on oil in particular, so the petro states, Venezuela, Saudi and places like that, all of a sudden they're in trouble because the trend now is going to be oil becomes less and less important. And it may take 15, 20, 30 years to get there, but it's the trend that's important. Now, all of a sudden, if the whole of OPEC suddenly becomes irrelevant in terms of oil, that's quite difficult because that's been their power base for the last 40, 50, 60 years. So, interestingly, completely out of left field, electric cars could become a geopolitical. It's that kind of thinking we need to kind of think about when we're looking at the future and say, how would we deal with that? From a pollution point of view, from a global warming point of view, not a bad idea, but there's other things going on as well. Green energy. There's a lot being said about green energy, but it's very slow and it's quite expensive at the moment. It's getting cheaper. Again, China is leading the development of solar panels and getting the costs per kilowatt down on a very rapid basis. And there are new materials coming along that will help that. But there is this huge focus on green, but to replace coal in particular, and even gas, is a massive ask when you think that's still 90–95% of the world's energy supply. Okay. So what about nuclear? What do we think about nuclear? Do we like nuclear? Not a lot. Why don't we like it? Dirty? Dangerous? Dangerous? Yeah, the half-life of the waste material, pressurized reactors, runaway reactions. Interestingly, there's a massive project going on in the south of France at the moment on nuclear fusion. Some of you may have heard of the ITER project, ITER, the International Thermonuclear, I can't remember what the ENR are, but it's the International Thermonuclear Experiment. It's an experimental reactor looking to produce a very huge amount of electricity for about 20 seconds for the princely sum of about 30 to 40 billion euros. That's one of the most expensive electricity in the world. This is nuclear fusion. Everybody thinks nuclear fusion is nice, clean fuel. There is a joke in nuclear circles, a little homily that says, nuclear fusion is only 30 years away, and it always will be. That's kind of what they say. But what if there was a nuclear fission which was slightly more acceptable? And again, there's been quite a lot of work done recently on thorium-powered alternative fuels, but thorium seems to be the lead one. Thorium is abundant around the world, unlike uranium. The reactor would be a non-pressure reactor. It would be an atmospheric pressure reactor. It is meant to be more efficient than uranium, and it cannot have a runaway reaction. If there is a problem, it's an external excitation. If there's a problem, it just runs safe. The fuel drains out and the reaction shuts down. So if you had that, think about what that might do to gas. Okay? Guess who's leading the field there? China. China has committed over 2,000 of their scientists, nuclear scientists, to having a commercial thorium reactor in some form. They're exploring different ways of doing it, but it's a huge effort. And if you think this is new, it's not. Thorium was around in the 1950s. The UK and America were debating whether to use thorium or uranium for their power. They had reactors of both. And they said, no, we won't go for the slightly more efficient thorium. We'll go for the slightly less efficient uranium. Anybody want to know why? Why did they do that? Because thorium doesn't produce weapons-grade material easily. There we go. Just a thought. Global warming, we kind of all know that. It's going to have a big issue. There's been some very recent work that's come out which says, you probably all know about the 2 degree setting, that we're trying to hold global warming down to less than 2 degrees from pre-industrial age. Big report has just come out. It's been an amalgamation of 6,000 previous reports which have all been analysed and collated, and 2 degrees isn't enough. Basically, that's the finding. 2 degrees isn't enough. 1.5 degrees would be the minimum that we need to get to. But we were never going to make 2 degrees anyway, the way we're going. So global warming is an interesting one. And it doesn't matter which side of the argument you're on. The key thing to remember is you could be for or against. You could say, no, it's not real, it is real. What they don't know is if there's going to be a tipping point. If there's a tipping point, what will be the cascade effects? Nobody really knows. So in the end, 8 billion people are now lab rats. You're undertaking in the greatest uncontrolled experiment in history, effectively, because nobody really knows what that tipping point is. So really interesting, a bit worrying. And then finally, on ambiguity, and this is really the big one. There's 4 little slides there. What we're talking about there is AI and machine learning. We're talking about biogenetics, bioengineering, bioimmunology, that sort of thing. We're talking about nanotechnology, and we're talking about quantum technology. Those are the 4 slides there. Those are all big issues which are going to fundamentally change our future. Okay? Let's have a quick look at AI. There's a lot being made about AI at the moment, and I'm fascinated by it, but AI and machine learning is really quite key. They're talking now about AI in terms of, we think it's just a computer, it's not very intelligent. People say it's not intuitive, it's not creative, it just crunches numbers. Hopefully we all know about computers in chess. Okay, Garry Kasparov was beaten, I think, back in 1998 by IBM's Deep Blue. Deep Blue also won Jeopardy. But staying with chess, since Kasparov was beaten, computers and humans have collaborated up until about 3 or 4 years ago in getting ever more creative, ever cleverer moves. And there was a massive increase in the complexity of chess with the AI-computer collaboration. That has now stopped. Humans add nothing more to the process. And one of the interesting things is the greatest chess computer is something called Stockfish 8. So Stockfish 8 is the culmination of a computer that has looked at centuries of chess games and analyzed them. So it's looked at centuries of human chess games. It's looked at decades of computer-generated chess games. It is the most sophisticated chess computer in the world. It can crunch 70 million chess positions a second. Okay? So they set it up in competition with Google's AlphaZero. Okay? Player 1 was Stockfish 8. Player 2 was AlphaZero. They played 100 games. AlphaZero won 28. It drew 72. It did not lose a single game in chess. So Stockfish 8, centuries and decades of computer moves, 70 crunches, 70 million positions a second. AlphaZero could only do 80,000 moves a second in its brain. The interesting thing was that AlphaZero was never taught to play chess. It was never shown any single chess games. It was never given any opening gambits. It was told, this is how the game works, teach yourself. It taught itself chess and then went up against Stockfish 8. Anybody know how long it took to learn chess to that level? 4 hours. 4 hours. Okay? And the moves that it came up with were original, creative, never seen before. And judges now in chess games, when they suspect a human of cheating and using a computer, the thing that guides them is whether the move is original. Okay? I won't spend too much time on biotechnology. I don't know a huge amount about it. I do know it's going to change our world. One of the areas where they're spending a lot of money is on aging. Certainly the Sergey Brins and the Larry Pages of Google fame, Alphabet, have committed $1.5 billion to Calico, the California Life Company, looking at aging. Can we cure aging? Can we extend human life? It's a big area. But bioimmunology is going to maybe change the world in terms of how we fight disease. It needs to come quickly because of the problems with the antibiotics. So there's a lot going on in bioengineering and biotechnology, which could change a lot of things in our world, I think. This is quite interesting here, the nanotechnologies. Lots and lots of things going on, but at the nano level, there are some new materials coming on, things like graphene, a Nobel Prize-winning material, often called the wonder material of our age, 200 times stronger than steel. It's 1 atom thick of graphite. High electrical conductivity, low thermodynamics. I mean, it is a wonder material, it's fantastic stuff. But even better in terms of electrical conductivity is stannine, which is what they call a 2D material. It's 1 molecular layer thick, gained from tin. It is 100% conductive at 100 degrees C. It could revolutionize computer chips and things like that. So massive things going on in nanotechnology and materials. And then finally, if I didn't know much about those things, I know even less about the last one, the quantum world. We'd hear a lot about quantum computing. Quantum computers exist. IBM and Google have one each, working at about 18 qubits each, and people can buy time on them. Okay? Very simply, when you look at a bit of technology, a bit is either 1 or 0, on or off. When you look at a qubit, a quantum bit, almost any number of positions you can have. So a single qubit has almost an infinite number of positions to calculate from. So very fast, very big crunching numbers. More interestingly is a bizarre thing called quantum entanglement. Okay? Einstein said he didn't believe in quantum entanglement. This is spooky action at a distance. Okay? Where you separate, if you like, an atom in one place, and what you do here affects the one over here, although they are separated in space and time. And he said, I don't believe this. It's spooky action at a distance. Guess who has proved that? It's been proven now many times told that it exists and it's real. Guess who's proven that to its largest extent to date? China. Using a satellite and 3 base stations, they've been able to prove quantum entanglement at 1,200 kilometers distance. This could give rise to what they call the quantum internet, which is pretty much an unhackable internet. Okay? So massive stuff going on here. Again, I know even less about that. But if you read about these things, these are things that are going to affect our world if they come up. Okay? So all I'm trying to do here is give you loads of information. Hang on to the red threads. How do we think about this stuff in the future? This is big stuff. How do I even think about doing something with an organization for 5 years, 6 years, 7 years when all of this is going on? Okay? That's really what the red thread is. So we talked about VUCA, VUCA. There are 2 more U's, which are really quite modern and quite new. Okay, so I kind of hid those from you. The world, I hope you realize, has become a much more untrusting place. Some of you may have heard of the Edelman Institute. The Edelman Institute runs something called the Trust Index or the Trust Barometer. Been doing it for 18 years. Over the last 10 years, trust has been declining at a regular rate, and in 2017 it was at its lowest ebb. And it was at its lowest ebb in the 4 main institutions of the world. 4 main institutions being? Government, media. Yeah, I quite like that one personally. But yeah, the government, press, NGOs, and business. Us. Yeah. And it's not surprising when you see what's going on. So trust has been really undermined by business. You think about Wells Fargo, you think about Volkswagen, you think about GlaxoSmithKline, you think about the levels of fines, 3 billion, 6 billion. I don't know what it's going to cost Volkswagen in the end. Wells Fargo is still ongoing. The media, Equifax, loads of stuff being hacked out in the public domain, no trust there. Google, Facebook, Facebook in particular, Cambridge Analytica, loads of people's data is being used without their knowledge for political reasons, I guess. News of the world in the UK, phone hacking, mobile phones being hacked. Not that difficult, apparently. Really interesting. So the world has become more untrusting. NGOs, if you think about what's happening with Save the Children, Oxfam, things like that. Exploitation of vulnerable people. Really, really tough stuff. So it's no wonder that the world's become more and more untrusting of what...
You say the world, you mean the Western world.
That's a really great point. It's a really great point. I would have to say the whole world. There's evidence around the world. However, I'm just going to finish this little bit here. There's my friend again. Would you believe this man? Absolute lies, but basically swung the Brexit vote. Okay. Anyway, it's a really good question. I want to come on to that. There are two major swings in the index. All right? It's been declining, but for 2018, most of the scores on trust have been low but stable. There are two major swings. Anybody care to know which countries have had major swings? US. So the US has had a major swing. Do you think that's up or down? Perfect, yeah. What a pessimist. Yeah. No, down. So on all the four levels, trust in the US has plummeted. Now the trust level, you begin to become trusted at a score of 60. So government in America was at 43, and it's dropped 6 points to 37. Okay, so it's gone down quite a lot. What's the other country where there's been a big trust swing? Good, yeah, not bad, but no, it's even more stark than that. China. Which way has China gone? Up. And again, trust in government is up. Trust in media is up by big points. China is up to 80. 84 in government on the trust index. Really interesting stuff. Yeah? Fascinating. I don't know maybe the government answered the questionnaire, I don't know. But there's some really, yes. Yes, up. And by quite a lot, another six or 7 points, and above 60. I think business is in the 70s, mid-70s. All of media is high, business is high, government is high. They don't do too much on the NGO side. So really interesting. Yeah. And unfair. This is the last one of the VUCA side of things. Anybody think the world's unfair? I know what my parents told me. The world isn't a fair place, but I never really believed them. Okay, so unfair. Let's have a look at unfair. There are 2,200 odd billionaires in the world. Between 2005 and 2016, the increase in their wealth over that period, just not their basic wealth, but the increase in the wealth, was $762 billion. It's been calculated it was enough, just the increase in wealth was enough to cure world poverty 7 times over. Okay? More interestingly, there's a few well-known names there: Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, I forgot, Arnaud, Jeff Bezos, the French guy, Arnaud, yeah, thank you. So we got those. In 2009, 360 billionaires owned more wealth than 50% of the world's population. Pretty staggering. In 2016, 64 billionaires owned more wealth than the poorest 50% of the population. Anybody know what the figure was last year? 42. So there's this concentration of wealth in hands. If we look at, there's a bit more. If you look at the sort of the richest 1% in America, the richest 1% of the world own 80% of its wealth. It's those sort of figures, this concentration of wealth in a few hands. There's a lot more figures I could give you, but I won't bore you with those. CEO to worker compensation. We've probably heard a little bit about that. Anybody getting nervous in the room about this area? I can move on very quickly. In America, they checked 14 million records of 225 companies to see what the ratios were. Give me a guess what you think the average ratio was of CEO pay, C-suite pay, to the average worker salary. 50 times? 50 times? Wow, you're generous. 339. 339 to 1. The largest ratio they found was 5,000 to 1. So they did the same experiment in the UK. They looked at FTSE 100 companies. FTSE 100 companies, ratio of CEO to average median pay. Sorry, average pay. Ratio in the UK? We're a mean lot over there, you know that. 160 to 1. Okay? And the largest discrepancy they found was 1,700 to 1. There's been a lot of psychological experience, a lot of behavioral economic experience about what the level should be before people start getting irritated by the difference. Anybody know what the maximum ratio would be before people start saying this is unfair? Yeah, 10 to 1? 20 to 1. 20 to 1, after that people say, is he really worth 20 times what I do? But 340, a bit tricky. So again, this unfair thing could actually have some kickback. Companies. Of the top 100 global economies, how many of them are corporations, do you think? Of the top 100 largest global economies, how many are corporations? 69. Right? 40 of them are in the top 60. Walmart has an economy that's bigger than Australia and slightly smaller than Canada. Just to put it in perspective. And then here, we're going to talk about this in a minute, about what you can do, but quite a lot of companies are succeeding and doing things to create wealth for the organization, but at the same time, they're kind of toasting the planet. So they're doing things which allow them to make money, but they're not accounting for all the costs of how they do it. So there's quite a big move going on there. So that's quite something to think about. Okay. And then finally, my favorite, when we talk about taxation, and we think about cross-border transfers and all the rest of it, Amazon's quite a big company, I think you'll agree. Anybody care to know how much more tax I paid than Amazon on a multiple basis? My little company in the UK paid 40 times more tax than Amazon on figures that don't represent their sales. So what Amazon did was they declared in the UK that their revenue was 1.46 billion, but they said that was for warehousing and logistics. They never sold a thing in the UK. Well, I know I contributed a hell of a lot to their profits. I know I bought stuff from them. So they declared 1.46 billion in the UK. And if I use that figure, I paid 40 times more tax than they did. Okay? I paid 19%, they paid 0.5. However, you look at their accounts in America, they declared $7.4 billion in sales in the UK, right? Which now means I paid 250 times more tax than they did. And that's happening all the time. So it's quite an interesting thing. You know, us as smaller companies who can't get away with some of this stuff has a disproportionate load. And if you think about how if you're highly innovative, highly creative, you've got the power and the energy to succeed, it's very difficult to overcome the sheer dead weight of people who can play the game because of their size. Just a thought. Okay? Okay? So that's kind of the shock side of things. Again, as we reach the end of the VUCA world, hold inside that red thread. I've just set out a really difficult, complex, uncertain, volatile world. How the hell do we plan as businessmen and business ladies about how we guide our organizations into the future? Do we just give up and say, we can only go short term? We can't think about this future. It's just too uncertain. Let's just concentrate on the here and now. Is that a good way to go, do you think? No, and that's what gives us a great quandary, a huge difficulty. So let's just have a look at this. One of the things that we can do, and I know this is a very much maligned word. Some people say, oh, not another vision. There's a particular county in the UK, which is Yorkshire, where they have very, very bluff, very down-to-earth people. And whenever I use the word vision, I say, oh, God, why can't we just get on and do some work? Why do we have to have these visions? But what a vision does, a vision sets out the what. What do we want to be? What position do we want to take? What is it that we're seeking to be? And that's a big question, and that kind of moves us away from the here and now. It means, where do we want to be at some stage in the future? And if you don't have that, you miss a few things. If we could put a few words in there about what that might do, what sort of things a vision might give an organization, what sort of words would spring to mind? Direction. It might give us direction. Sustainable. It might give us some sort of long-term drive that gives us a sustainable future. I like that, yeah. Anything else? Focus. Can I hold that one? We're going to come on to that, but it fits somewhere else. Yeah, it sets out some values. And again, that might also fit somewhere else, but the values will be in there as well, because they drive behaviors and helps us with our what. Anything else? Clarity. Yeah, that again, you know, there's two things coming here. There's vision, and we're going to come on to purpose in a minute. So if I just show you some of the words that I sort of thought about, our aspiration, our ambition, insight, foresight, energy, enthusiasm, excitement. If you have a big enough vision, some of these things might actually be achievable. So direction, stability, sustainability, all these sort of things. So that's why vision, I think, is quite important. And even more important when we look at this unstable, volatile world, we need to have something kind of big to anchor us into the distance. If we don't have that anchor out there, it's very difficult to kind of have any real direction at all. And if you think about some of the largest companies who work in very high-tech, companies like Google, working in very high-tech, you'd say, well, if you're in high-tech, everything's changing very fast. Anybody know what Google's vision time span is? 20 years? Shell, people like that, 30 years. So these are companies working in exactly the same world with very, very long time spans in terms of their vision. Okay? So I'm just going to have a quick time check. How am I doing? The alarm hasn't rung. So that moves us on to purpose. We've got vision, which sort of sets out what is it we want to be. Purpose. Let's do the same little exercise. What might purpose give us? I'll take the focus. I'll take the focus one if that's okay. What else might purpose give us? Something to live, a reason for being. Yeah, I like that. Purpose, a reason for being. What else might it say? Relevance. Yeah. About, what do we stand for? Yeah, the relevance, what are we doing here? You can see these are quite big words. So if we, again, I'll go back to that one. Some fairly big stuff going on there. If you think about your people in your organization, if they buy into this, if they believe this vision, and they can only believe it if the leadership believes it, by the way. Okay? But if they believe it, that's powerful stuff. If you go into the why, it gives meaning to the organization. It's what you stand for. There's a philosophy, there's an ethos. It's your distinction. It sets you apart from everybody else that in your sector or your segment. So again, if you can get purpose right, you might even get engagement and energy. Engagement's an interesting one. There have been a lot of studies done, certainly in America and the UK. Anybody know what the average level of engagement is in the big listed companies? Less than 50%, correct. How much less? It's 17. The engagement in companies is reckoned to be round about 17%, which means 83% of people are disengaged. But what's more interesting is, they're turning up and they're doing a job, but sort of not fully engaged. What's interesting is that on average, about 20% are actively disengaged, which means they're looking to leave in the current year. If you drop that down to the millennial generation, it goes up to 25%. And if you increase the time span to 2 years, 44% are looking to leave the organization in 2 years. So engagement's a really key issue, and that can be sort of served with purpose. So if we can combine those two things, this what do we want to be, what do we stand for, why are we doing this, what might it give us? A bit of a clue there, by the way. If we take a 15 to 20-year view, which is normally quite a good way for a vision to think about for most organizations, what you get is motive force, something that takes you into the future. We start off down here and we want to be in a bigger, better place, whatever that means. sometime in the future. And that kind of gives you this motive force. And normally if I work with companies, one of the first things I look for, has this company got any, does it know where it's going? Does it have this energy to take it into the future? Because, you know, if you're thinking about strategies and things, it's very difficult to hang a strategy off a company that says, well, we're kind of here. And that's it. Yeah? So, you know, motive force is quite important. And then, if we then, oops, sorry, going the wrong way. If we then take those, and I don't want to talk about strategy too much, but I'm just going to touch on it briefly, because unless you have those, it's difficult to know where your strategies fit. But if you have a 15 to 20 year vision and purpose, you can now hang your strategies off that in these 3 to 5 year blocks. Okay? So all of a sudden, you now have a kind of coherent way of approaching the future. But the nice thing is, purpose and vision give you that kind of longer term stability, but your strategy can change to suit the changing conditions, but they are anchored to a core sort of element to the organization. Just a thought about one of the things you can do. Okay? Here's a bit of a problem. Doesn't work. Yeah. It doesn't work in a particular way. If you are a board of a listed company, you're the new CEO, CFO, COO, whatever it is, you've just moved into this new company, you've set your vision and your purpose, you've anchored in your first strategy, and you're now underway. You get to the end of year 1, and you miss the numbers. What's going to happen? Maybe not right away. Shareholders might be getting a bit antsy. Yeah? So they say, sort it out. You get to the end of year 2, oops, we've missed the numbers. What are the shareholders thinking now? Are you the right people for the job? You might, if you're lucky, get a 3rd year. Right? But if you miss the numbers again, what's going to happen is CEO changes, CFO changes, COO changes, and when they come in, these shy, shrinking violets who have no egos or anything else, they're going to say, we love that vision, we love that purpose, it's going to be fine, we'll leave it as it is, we'll just change. Are they going to do that? They're going to change everything. How do the people feel? Oh, here we go again. Okay? So the listed environment in particular, this is really difficult, but also in non-listed it can happen as well. So if you can't maintain that stability, it becomes very difficult. I'll give you an interesting listed case. Johnson & Johnson. Okay, Johnson & Johnson, one of the most admired companies in the world over the last 60, 70 years in general, in terms of financial performance, best place to work, the way they treat people. They have 4 credos. The first credo is our first responsibility is to our customers, the doctors and patients who use our product. Second credo is our second responsibility is to our people. Third one is our responsibility is to our communities. And the fourth one is our final responsibility is to our stockholders. Provided we run a good business, provided we set aside money for risk and contingency, we should run a successful organization. If we run a successful organization, our stockholders should make a fair return. So the stockholder is 4th and a qualified 4th. But it's still one of the most admired companies. Over that period of 70 or 80 years, they've had about 12 different chairman CEOs, the combined role, the worst possible thing that you talk about, all this power in one hand. And they've never changed the credo. They've held that all the way through. So it can be done, but it's very powerful. And mostly those guys have come from the inside. They've lived with the credo. Okay? So it can be done. So what else can we do? Well, what happens is we have these things called low road temptations. So if you don't have good vision, good purpose, if you don't take what we call the high road, high integrity, high purpose, high road, you can be tempted into a low road organization. So you have bad actor competitors. They do bad things. You say, well, if we don't do bad things, we can't compete. We have to cut corners. We have to shave costs. We have to give lesser quality. You end up being sucked into the same swamp. And I won't go through all of these, but a desire for short-term gains. I was working with a group yesterday, and we talked about agency theory and the issuing of stock options. It didn't have any real impact in performance at all, but salaries rocketed by 14 times. Okay, but performance didn't go up the same amount at all. So frying the planet, quite interesting. There's no real cost for frying the planet. You know, you can get away with pollution, things like that. It doesn't really cost you a huge amount. It's getting better now. There's a lot more focus on this. But certainly 20, 30 years ago, there wasn't a huge cost for for not paying for your carbon, not paying for your pollution, not paying for whatever it was. Okay. So the real cost of goods hasn't been really factored in. And no meaningful weak institutions. When institutions are weak, capitalism actually doesn't really work very well. Just on that point, I mentioned this yesterday, Harvard has a new program out called Reimagining Capitalism. It's an elective program. It's one of the most popular elective programs going at the moment. Okay? It's about how does capitalism reinvent itself, and it talks about all of this sort of stuff. But things are changing. Now, again, when we talk about that, the capital markets, where we go to for our money, a lot of the top players, a lot of the people who are kind of ethical capital, not ethical investors, but have an approach that says companies that have good ESG are probably worth investing in. The top 30% of capital providers are really interested in companies that have good ESG, environmental, social, and governance issues. And that means that people have to change. Interesting, if you look here, I've put here the Norwegian Sovereign Fund. The Norwegian Sovereign Fund has investments in 1.4% of the capital markets, right? Which means they have an investment in every single company in the world, effectively. Right? And they can only it only works for them if they take a very long-term, 20, 30, 40-year view. They can't keep taking short-term views. So they are really interested in people who've got long-term vision, good ESG, who are going to run good businesses. And all of those other things, politicians are feeling the heat, so they're going to try and strengthen their institutions. We've just seen the fines that are being meted out. Petrobras, 7 billion, Google, 5 billion, the Libor guys, 6 billion. But actually, these are tiny amounts. When GlaxoSmithKline was fined $3 billion, their stock rose. When Goldman Sachs was fined and paid the fine, their stock rose. Volkswagen stock's back to where it was. So actually, the markets aren't penalizing the companies very much at all. Okay, just a thought. Tricky. The key thing, really, I think, are these two in the middle, media, social media, populism, and activism. I think there's going to be huge rising pressures coming from those areas. This spotlight of media interest is going to focus on us as leaders of organizations more than we think over the next few years. And interestingly, what I would call the mainstream press is actually getting higher trust now than social media. When we took at Edelman's Trust Index, it's the mainstream press that seems to be much more respected than some of the social media outlets now. Just an interesting change. And there's an increase in the purpose-driven organizations. I've given you some examples there. There's a lot more. Walmart is a purpose-driven organization and actually has very good ESG in terms of energy and water. KKR, anybody know KKR? Kohlberg Roberts. When they take over, they are avaricious capitalists. But when they move into an organization, they have a team that goes in and immediately starts focusing on energy saving, water saving, anything around ESG, because it's good business. They can save 25%, they can make 25% savings. So even that sort of rabid capitalist, KKR, understands the value of this stuff. Okay. And the payoffs. Harvard has done a huge study on productivity, 500,000 records, effectively. And what they found is that companies which have high purpose, they take the high road, high integrity, are twice, the companies in the top percentile are twice as productive as companies in the bottom percentile. They're more creative and more innovative, okay? But there's an interesting thing about this kind of purpose thing. We kind of think of it as being soft and fluffy, a bit vision-y, a bit purposey. They found that when they first did the study, there wasn't a huge difference. So they said, what's going on here? And they split it into companies that had purpose and vision that was soft and fluffy, felt like a family, everybody loved it. Very Californian. And then there were companies that had purpose and vision, but metrics and measures and goals. Which one was the high productivity one? Soft and fluffy family, measures, metrics, and goals. Any thoughts? Ah, interesting. Because we kind of think soft and fluffy, everybody's happy, we must all get on. Sounds like high productivity. We all support each other. It was the companies that had high purpose, high integrity, took the high road, but had clear goals, clear measures that people could measure themselves by. So that's when they got the high productivity. So again, looking at it from a hard-bitten business point of view, the two are not incompatible. In fact, you need the two to work together. Good purpose, good vision, and good goals and objectives and measures. Okay. Lovely little company, Patagonia. Some of you may have heard of Patagonia, sometimes unfairly called Patagucci. I don't know if you heard that. They are an absolute environmental strong company. They give 1% of their revenue, not profits, 1% of their revenue every year to environmental concerns, come hell or high water. Doesn't matter what their profits do, that's sacrosanct. More interestingly, they have had an advert, one-page advert in the Times, don't buy this jacket. They're encouraging people not to buy new jackets, but to repurpose their old ones. They started a company called Common Threads to repair old Patagonia jackets. Even more daring, they've had an advert out, a video clip, saying, we do bad things. We use these chemicals. These are nasty. We use this this padding. This is our carbon proof. We are doing bad things, but we know it and we're trying to fix it. Guess what happened to their customer loyalty? So actually, it's been great for business. They were about $540 million 4 or 5 years ago. They're over $1 billion now. So this transparency and honesty, it's counterintuitive, but people are interested in this stuff. Okay, I couldn't get away from my little merchant navy background. You are the captains of your ship. You're the captains, and a board is basically captains and navigators. And it isn't always sunny, calm seas, and we're all out on deck sunbathing and drinking Mai Tais or whatever it is. Sometimes our world is like this, and we have a responsibility to get not just the ship and its goods, but our people as well through this highly volatile world. So what can you do? How can you deal with these conditions? And this is where we're kind of wrapping up towards the end. You need to take a future view. If I say we're looking out into the future, back here, what do we think about information back here? 6-month information, 1-year information. How do we feel about that information? Things like figures, health and safety, machine efficiency, quality, customer conversions. How do we feel about that data? Secondary. But reliability, pretty high reliability. Yeah, we quite like it. And when you look at the board papers coming over your desks, where do the board papers tend to focus? Kind of here. If I go, let's go further out. Let's go to here, 5 years, 6 years out. What do we think about information out here? Not reliable, fuzzy, blurry. Yeah, blurry, noise. There's a lot of white noise around it. There's a huge amount of it. As the further you move out, there's a lot more information. It's uncertain, it's unclear, it's white noise and everything else. So we don't like that. We don't like it at all, because how do you make sense of that? So we tend to retreat back to the areas where, and most of us have come from operational areas. You know, we were finance people, we were marketing people, we were engineers. So the figures that we see coming over the board paper, we're quite comfortable with those. It's where we came from. Right? So it's quite nice second-guessing the person who got your job last and saying, oh, yeah, I wouldn't have done it like that. However, this is where we find, out here, it's so far out, there be dragons. If you think about the old charts that sailors used, when you got to the edge of the map, you fell off the end, and it said, there be dragons. Okay? So we can only go out so far. Okay? And then most of what we do in board levels, when I talk to people about strategy, I say, how much time do you spend on strategy? The best answers I get are about 10 to 15%. It's normally between 5 and 10% that boards spend on strategy. We need to be spending quite a lot more. Ford, I think, now spend over 30% of their time on strategy. After the crash, they said, we need to know more about the future. We missed a trick. And then finishing off, that's where we need to be spending more time. And we need to be comfortable with the 40-70 rule. You will never have enough information. But if you're making decisions with less than 40% of the information, you're relying on instinct, intuition, what you think is your experience, and maybe even blind luck. But if you're trying to get more than 70% of the information, you're looking for perfection, accuracy. You're probably going to take too much time to do it, and you may miss, well, you probably will miss the window of opportunity. All strategies have a window of opportunity. So as leaders of organizations, you need to be really comfortable in this zone of uncertainty, making decisions with less than perfect information. So, and you can only do that if you become more comfortable out here. You won't know everything, but you just need to become more comfortable. You probably all know this one. This is the Boston box. I'm not going through a strategy program. I just want to show you how this works. You probably all know it's very easy to get a very quick share price increase by getting rid of all the costs that you have in your future and everything else, concentrate on the cash cows. That's not what I wanted to talk about. Talking about the future, this to me is one of the most powerful little models in business. It's the life cycle curve. It's either the life cycle curve of the industry, your product, or your service. The curve can be used for many things. And what often happens is that we allocate our question marks, we allocate our stars, our cash cows, and our dogs to that kind of model, okay? And we use it fairly simplistically. But if you become more comfortable with the future, if your curve goes on to do that, then that dog is valid, and you're probably going to get rid of it. But I've seen people get rid of dogs, which they think are dogs, when the business actually does this. And all of a sudden, you've got an extended curve which gives you the opportunity to be a cash cow. If your customers can't leave you very easily, you can even put your prices up. Okay, so knowing what's going on in the future, your curve may even do that. I've been in businesses where we've done it, and you go back into star territory. Or it may just carry on. But in the end, we have to think about a very complex business. We need to understand what's going on with everything that we do and understand how complex our world is, because we could be making some good decisions for the wrong reasons and some wrong decisions for the right reasons. It could be a real mess. So we really do need to understand how complex our future world is, because it does change. And then some of you will know ANSOF, anybody who's done some of these things. ANSOF is a really simple model. I want to move it into the future. Whenever you think about an ANSOF, I'd like you to just add these. If you put the curves in there, it changes the way you think about where you're going. And ANSOF very simply says, this is where we are now. Things are getting difficult. We can't penetrate our market anymore. We can't find a buyer. We need to think about doing something else. Let's invent something new. And I promise you, I have seen companies do this. They say, we don't like it here. We need to do something new. Let's go there. How clever is that? They move to the top end of the curve. What you want to be doing is to try and join a curve down here. And the same with this market here. So once you put those curves in, you think, it causes us to think as leaders, are we jumping from the wrong place to the right place? Right? Because you then question everything by which markets you move into. Does that make sense? It's a very simple representation. But I cannot tell you the number of companies who've done a huge amount of work and then jump from the frying pan into the fire. Okay? Quite key. And then finally, I think we're nearly finally there. Yeah, summary. Those 10 points, I'll leave you a little bit of time to look at those, but basically create a clear high road, create a resonating purpose with purposeful goals, set the tone as leaders, sensitize your organization to a range of possible futures. Some of you may have heard of scenario planning. Okay? Scenario planning is, just finish. Will never be right. You will tell a series of stories about the futures. Not one of those stories will be right, but that's not the point. The point is that you become sensitive to a range of possible futures so that you just understand that this could happen, but it won't happen quite like that, or that could happen. And you can see which way you're tracking. This one here, do the hard work. Strategy is hard work. It's one of the reasons why strategies fails, is that the leadership of organization gets very excited in the first few months to create a strategy, lob it over the fence to their executors and say, make that happen, and then kind of step back. You need to remain engaged to make sure that it's happening, that the firm stays excited about it for the whole duration, 3 to 5 years. Really quite tricky. Finally, these last three for me are all about people. Okay, really critical. You have to trust your people and display your trust in them. That's quite key. And they have to trust you. Let them free up their knowledge. High-purpose organizations allow their people's knowledge to come to the fore. And finally, people are really your most important asset. I talk about the two big lies in business. The first big lie is people are our most important asset. And then organizations demonstrate that actually they're not. The second big lie is we welcome competition. Okay, interesting. Okay, so be happy here. And if you do that, you should be able to come a VUCA world. I'd like to finish off really just with a little story, real story. You may even know the organization, one of them. Just before the dot-com crash, 1999, there were two companies in a little town called Chelmsford. One of them was called Marconi. Does anybody know Chelmsford? Yeah? I'm sorry. Two companies. One was called Marconi, who you may know. The other one was called Global Marine. It was part of Cable and Wireless at one stage. And Global Marine was a $1 billion company. Marconi was a $51 billion company. Had a new CEO, new CFO. And in 1999, 2000, they went on a buying spree, buying companies because the telecoms market was going up. The little company half a mile around the corner said, not entirely sure we like what's going on. And we looked at what was happening with technology, we looked at what was happening with competition, we looked at what was happening with telecoms in general, deregulation, privatization. We said, we don't like this very much. We think the market is actually going to crash. So our hypothesis was the market is going to crash, and then we went out to test it. Will it crash? Won't it crash? What might be the drivers? And at the end of that process, we said, we believe it's going to crash. We began a process in the beginning of 2000, when the market was still rocketing upwards, of divesting ourselves of assets. We started selling stuff, very visible in the market. We couldn't hide it. You don't hire, you don't get rid of big cable ships and depots without people seeing what you're doing. And we began to halve the size of the company, 5,000 people down to 2,500 people, 28 capital units, factories, down to 14, at a time when Marconi were buying. Everybody know what happened after that? .com crash. Give you an idea of the severity, a unit across the Atlantic before the crash was $13 million, a unit of capacity, $13 million, but you could only buy it for 10 years on an irredeemable right of usage. After the crash, you could buy that for $1,000 for a week. Just dropped off a cliff. Marconi, anybody know where they are now? Gone. Little Global Marine, still the market leader in its field. Again, taking a view on the future. Thank you all very much indeed.